In the mid-1960s, two UFO researchers began to uncover secrets they shouldn't, and the nightmares and attacks that began to stem from it would lead to horrific emotional and even physical consequences at the hands of them. You won't want to miss this one. In 1941, during the height of World War II, a man named John Stewart from Hamilton, New Zealand had a rather bizarre sighting. During Operation Crusader, John witnessed a strange glowing orange ball in the sky that defied explanation. This sighting alone stuck with him for years to come. In addition to it, there wasn't anywhere he could go for answers because remember, this was the early 1940s. But as the years progressed into the late 40s and early 50s, there were other people like him reporting strange things in the sky that they too couldn't explain. Feeling vindicated, he knew that he had to get to the bottom of it no matter the cost. In 1948, his obsession turned to him spending hours going through newspapers, looking for any reports of something in the sky, anything he could find. He would go to the library and check out any book he could find on that subject. He would get books from all over the world, something that at this time was a lot harder to do. Well, one thing led to another, and John soon found himself involved with the more fringe groups of society at the time, the most prominent of which was the civilian saucer investigation. Now, what takes place here sets the chain of events for the entirety of this story. In 1952, sometime around 11:30 in the evening, John Stewart would receive a disturbing phone call that would change the course of his entire career and potentially his life. Immediately after picking up, a mysterious voice on the other end of the line asks him if this is John Stewart. Slightly confused and off-put by this, he simply responds yes, and then the voice asks him an extremely bizarre question. It asks him, "Are you the John Stewart who is interested in what Earthmen call flying saucers?" What? Who talks like that? He's thinking, who on earth is this? And so he's like, yeah, what can I do for you? Now, in a split second, the voice changes from calm to aggressive and issues him a stern warning. Stop interfering in affairs that do not concern you. Now, this pisses John off because he's thinking, who's this wise guy giving me a call in the middle of the night making threats to me? And so he's like, hey, listen, pal, who the hell are you talking to? Who is this? And this is where things continue to get weirder and weirder. The voice responds back and tells him something that sounds like it's straight out of a science fiction film. He hears whoever is on the other line tell their name, but it sounds like gibberish, a language he's never heard before, a name he couldn't pronounce even if he wanted to. However, the oddest part was that it added "from another planet" at the end of the sentence. Okay, this is clearly a prank, and not a funny one. John, now obviously angered, just tells this mysterious prankster to go to hell and goes to hang up on them. But before that happens, what followed was a series of sinister warnings. It told him that if he and those around him were to continue to poke their noses where it didn't belong, that harm would come to them. Now, humorously, at the end of this warning, in the most stereotypical and cliche robot alien voice exclaimed, "Beware, Earthmen!" John was just about to hang up on this prankster when they issued out their last 4 words. "You have been warned." The line went dead. John was very bothered by this phone call because it was so nefarious and threatening. It seemed a little out of place just to be a simple prankster, you know? In fact, right before this happened, he had who he thought was a prankster ring his doorbell, and when he went to answer it, there was no one outside. But as all these events start taking place, it's hard not to draw connections. Fast forward to April 1953, and John got involved with a newly formed UFO group known as the Flying Saucer Investigation Society, otherwise known as FSIS. While in this group, he met a beautiful young woman, Doreen Wilkinson, and these two young lovers hit it off like you can't imagine. They would soon spend all their time together, bonding over their shared interest in UFOs and strange unidentified phenomena. However, as romantic as this sounds, John was actually married. And even years later, John swore up and down that it was never more than just two researchers united by a common goal: to uncover the mystery behind flying saucers. Sure, John. Interestingly, when John and Epsis parted ways, he and Doreen went on to form a new group, the Flying Saucer Investigators. Wow, John, real original. Now, while John was continuously adamant that he and Doreen were nothing more than friends, she continued to make unwanted advances towards him during this time. And it's not what you think. She had such an abrupt personality change that he was convinced she had been overtaken by otherworldly forces, or, possession, to put it bluntly. Her behavior began to become increasingly strange, and in fact, during one of their outings, as she was saying goodbye to him, it sounded to him as if she was crying for help. In fact, John would write this about the experience.
I walked to the gate with her, and it seemed that once again, Doreen was the same innocent young person she had been before her strange conversation of that evening. I opened the gate, told her to sleep well. She paused momentarily, and I stood there, just a bit embarrassed by the silence. Suddenly, she threw her arms around my waist, pressed her head to my shoulder, and whispered, "Help me, Johnny, help me." Before I could ask her what was wrong, she had released me and was running down the walkway.
As weird as this is, it wasn't just Doreen who seemed possessed. There were often instances where it appeared that odd behavior was coming from John. In fact, John detailed how he would have entire conversations that he would have no memory of. He would just come to the moment they had finished, only to be confused and have to ask Doreen what had happened. Apparently, Doreen informed him that he would ramble on about strange UFO theories in an eerie, strange, cold, and monotonous voice that wasn't his own. This is getting creepy, so what's going on here? In fact, during one conversation that had taken place at John's home, Doreen had stopped mid-sentence and looked over John's shoulder. The look on her face was pure terror, and John would say this.
I turned and saw a stranger standing almost behind me, a soft smile on his rather effeminate face. I sprang to my feet, seeing that Doreen was sitting quite still. I asked the man who he was and how he got into my home. A soft smile was his reply, and at last he told us he was a spaceman and had called to add his words to the warning I had received some months before. I put his age at about 30 years. He was tall and slimly built, but I was not fooled with this slim appearance, realizing that there were well-developed muscles beneath the black suit he wore. He was tanned to a deep tan color, and his hair was quite long, being very fair. His eyes were a soft blue and held a friendly expression. The stranger again told us to leave well enough alone and to cease our investigations. His eyes moved to Doreen, and he pointed out that she would be in danger if we persisted. With this warning still in our ears, the stranger vanished from view.
Wait a minute. You're telling me that they're now being visited by the Men in Black? This is getting interesting. And just you wait, because things were about to get pretty crazy. We're going to fast forward to June of 1954, and John was driving home late one night, and he looks at his windshield and spots something off in the distance. And as you guys can imagine, it's exactly what it sounds like. Jonathan was witnessing a flying saucer just outside his home. This thing drew so near to him and actually came close to 100 feet from the ground before it abruptly vanished. Completely overcome with emotion and shocked beyond belief, he would go on to share his encounter with Doreen, and this is where part of the conversation began to turn. You see, the conversation evolved from John's sighting into the warnings that they had continuously received. Most disturbingly of all, Doreen was in danger. Doreen was also very adamant and passionate about UFOs, and so no matter how much John begged and pleaded, she wasn't ready to give up her research. John knew that if she didn't stop, things would only end badly for Doreen. Suddenly, it happened. In mid-conversation, Doreen suddenly sat up with her eyes completely widened and whispered to John in a panicked voice, "What was that?" There was something in the room with them, or someone. and as disturbing as this was, they began to hear heavy breathing. Now, unfortunately, neither of them could see anything, so they were very confused, and they quickly looked around, panic-stricken, and John even noted to Doreen that it sounded like someone had a serious case of asthma. However, the breathing only lasted mere moments and then ended. Both of them now were completely shaken up, and so John lit a cigarette to try and, calm his nerves, because it's the 1950s and literally everyone smoked. Not really, but you get it. And he's taking long drags of his cigarette and looks over at Doreen, and she's on the verge of a mental breakdown. Something was wearing and weighing down on her. Maybe it was time for both of them to just give up this whole UFO investigation for good, they figured. Well, the night ends pretty normally, and the week goes by without anything uneventful. Until Friday. The two get together again for another romantic rendezvous. I mean, to discuss UFOs, And so at some point during their discussions, Doreen realizes that they've smoked through all of their cigarettes and tells John, "Hey, I gotta head down to the corner store to pick up some more cigarettes. I'll be back quickly." And off she goes. No biggie, right? Well, while she's gone, John is just sitting there, lost in thought about all the crap they've been going through recently. The UFO he saw, the strange experiences they've been having, the possession episodes. And you know how it is when you get lost in thought after a while. You simply lose track of time. At some point, he realizes, Doreen's been gone for quite some time. Pretty sure this isn't normal. Slam! The front door opens, and it's Doreen who stumbles in. John can immediately tell there's something very, very wrong. She's in complete hysterics, crying her eyes out. "There's something out there." And she's pointing. John's freaked out by this, and in his own words, wrote this.
Quickly releasing her, I hurried outside, stopping on the top step as a terrible stench struck me. I almost fainted in terror. It was like burnt plastic and sulfur. I stood there for a moment, and then walked down to the front gate, neither seeing nor hearing anything. I retraced my steps, seeing Doreen was on the upper step, watching me. I searched the rear of the grounds, finding nothing, and had just started to return to the door when I heard distinct sounds behind me. I stopped and shone my flashlight. There was nothing there. I walked on. The sounds followed. I stopped, and the sound stopped. I moved. It moved. Again I stopped, was amazed and startled when it kept on. The peculiar shuffling, scraping sound went past me, and I felt something solid brush against my shoulder. This was the first indication I'd had that they were as solid as I.
It seems as if John and Doreen had made physical contact together and with some invisible forces of some kind. Now he can hear this thing moving in the direction of the front gate, so quickly thinking, he moves to the front door and joins Doreen there. Now she's frantic and tells him she heard the same thing outside when she went to the store. And so he pulls her inside. He's shaken up. He doesn't know what to do. So in typical 50s fashion, he goes in, pours the two of them a drink, to try and calm their nerves. And he's contemplating what the next steps are. Should they just separate at this point? But whatever is outside is still there, and he doesn't want it to harm Doreen. John has a horrifying realization. Whatever this thing is, it can come and go as it pleases. It was probably the same thing breathing in the room the other night. It's capable of going through walls and locked doors. They're dealing with something otherworldly here. What if this thing is able to get to Doreen while they are separated? He won't be able to save her. Realizing that she'll be safer if she sticks with John, the two of them quickly run to the rear of the house and step outside. Immediately, they realize just how dark it is. Things are too quiet and it's creepy. And so the two of them quietly make their way around the corner to leave, and they both stop in their tracks. Folks, I could tell you in my own words what happened next, but I think John does a pretty good job at describing the events next.
We stared at the evil thing that faced us about 27 feet across the lawn. It was loathsome. Hideous, evil, disgusting, horrifying. It was about 8 feet in height. We stood transfixed, staring in complete horror at the monster in the exceptionally bright moonlight. I felt a desire to take Doreen and run as fast as possible from it, but I discovered I had no willpower to move a finger. I was helpless. The monster's head was large and bulbous, no neck, A huge and ungainly body supported on ridiculously short legs. It had webbed feet. The arms were thin and not unlike stalks of bamboo. It had no hands, the long fingers jutting from the arms like stalks. Its eyes were about 4 inches across, red in color. There was no nose, just 2 holes, and the mouth was simply a straight slash across its appallingly lecherous face. The hole was a green lime in color, and it was possible to see red veins running through its ungainly form. The monster was definitely male.
Now, whatever this thing was appeared far more interested in Doreen than John. It began moving, reaching out its arm toward Doreen, and it had gotten so close that it could practically touch her face. And even worse, the closer it gets, it's almost as if it gains control over Doreen and can keep her rooted to the very spot where she stands. John's now on the verge of tears because he doesn't know what else to do at this point. They're completely frozen in place, and just as this thing gets within inches of her face, it suddenly stops and begins slowly retreating back in the direction it came from. Before it goes out of sight, it dissolves in front of them like shadows do. John and Doreen come back to and use every bit of willpower in them to flee back inside. They're both completely frantic, and so they just start chain smoking and they're drinking, doing anything they can to try and calm their frayed nerves. Now later on, they would both admit to seeing the same thing, as disturbing as that is. At this point, John realizes he must escort her back to her house because sticking around with him isn't an option anymore. Fortunately, he's able to drop Doreen off with no issues, and the two say their goodbyes, but as you can imagine, neither of them are really doing mentally well. In fact, they're both pretty messed up from everything that's gone on so far. John and Doreen are not sleeping much either. What's fascinating is that within a day or so of John's returning home and telling his family about what happened, this neighbor girl decides to drop in and show John what she's been sketching. And we're not talking about just one sketch, we're talking about several sketches here. This girl has been drawing odd things in John's backyard, and as John looks at these sketches, the guy can hardly believe his eyes. What he's looking at, the thing that this girl sketched repeatedly, is the exact and accurate representation of the thing he and Doreen had seen the night before. I can't even imagine the amount of terror that overcame him at that moment. I mean, if you're John, what do you even do with this? How do you begin to process this emotionally? I mean, it's not like you can tell anyone. What are you going to do, call the police? You're pretty much isolated from any real help. And things did not look good for John or Doreen at this point. Also around this time, well, after John saw the sketches, John had visited Doreen on a separate occasion to, again, try and plead with her to stop investigating UFOs. That this has to be the cause of why all this is happening, and it's causing this thing to stalk them. He's frightened that the worst is yet to come. Now, Doreen, being stubborn and still, after all they've gone through at this point, still refuses to back down and quit her passion. What else is there for John to do? Well, days continue to pass, and as you guys can guess, it was only a matter of time before the worst was going to happen. In the process of getting ready for bed one evening, Doreen began to notice this strange smell that had mysteriously filled up her entire bedroom. She was very perplexed by this because, as far as she could tell, there was no real discernible source of the odor. She just shrugged her shoulders and just did her best to ignore it and took her usual bath, followed by a cigarette. Now, what happens next is utterly terrifying. In fact, Doreen herself wrote about it and said this.
Suddenly I had the impression that I was not alone, that unseen eyes were studying me. This impression was so strong that I searched the room, finding nothing. I returned to sit on the bed and to go over in my mind some of the research John and I were doing. The impression of unseen eyes persisted, but I forced myself to ignore it. I crushed my cigarette out and turned to pick up my pajamas, freezing as someone touched my shoulder. I jerked upright, my eyes closed in fear. I found that I was unable to move. I gradually mustered the willpower to force my eyes open to see my attacker. I almost fainted away. I could see nobody in the room. Whatever or whoever it was invisible. Hours seemed to pass, during which time I seemed to be able to remember all details. Finally, the horror was gone. The attack ceased as suddenly as it had begun. I dragged myself to a sitting position and stared at my body, shuddering as I saw the fine scratches I was covered with.
Folks, this was the same being or entity that John and Doreen saw, only what I assume was days before all of this. I don't think there are specific times given between when they saw the entity outside at night to this experience, but it couldn't have been too long. For 2.5 hours, Doreen was assaulted and attacked by this unknown assailant. Now, it's unclear if she was overcome with some strange trance or what, but wouldn't you try and exit the house or run out or do something? I mean, it's hard to say for sure because there's not a lot of detail on these events. And as you can imagine, John was absolutely shaken by what had happened to Doreen and would eventually leave the UFO field altogether. According to John, his wife finally had enough of this and told him it needed to be done. Or was it his and Doreen's relationship she was objecting to? Well, we will never know for sure. But folks, the story doesn't end there. No. John saw this thing one final time. Sometime after Doreen's horrific attack, the neighbor girl was over talking with John in the evening about the case of the creature this girl had sketched. And after conversation, the girl eventually left, which meant that John was all alone. Lost in thought and emotion, he sat up late at night, unable to sleep, just watching the night sky and probably smoking and having a drink. Well, it comes to around 1:30 in the morning, and when he was just getting tired enough and convinced himself that, you know what, it's time to turn in for the night, he gets up, gets ready to turn the light off in his study, and he suddenly stops. Now he's frozen in place because there's something only 5 feet away from him. He looks up and realizes it's exactly what we all think it is. The thing that's been tormenting him and Doreen is here now. However, it didn't attack him like it did Doreen. Instead, it spoke to him telepathically. Here's what John claimed it said.
Your friend knew too much and had to be silenced. We sent one of us to her as a warning. We weren't ready to allow it to complete its task at that time. 13 of us were present, only 3 were actually involved. We scratched her because it was something we couldn't avoid, and her bruises are there to remind her of us. You have been warned. Take heed. Should you fail, there will be others to suffer. You have told another of your research. Tell her no more, or we will have our revenge upon her. You understand? She too will suffer if you are foolish. If you persist, you will soon see what we can do.
I don't know why, they're not related at all, but I'm getting Night Flyer vibes from this. This right here is, according to John, why he stopped pursuing UFOs altogether. And here's what's interesting though. There's a contradiction. Shocker, I know. Author and researcher Jerome Clark made an audio recording back in 1962 that painted a different picture. Jerome wrote this.
In this one, John suffers an attack of amnesia after Doreen's departure and wanders the streets in a dazed state, finally to be rescued by another woman. He lives with her for a time before returning home, where in September 1955 he receives a telegram from Doreen, who asks him to come see her at a private nursing home where she has given birth to an out-of-wedlock baby boy. The two have a tense exchange in which Doreen first describes the otherworldly attack to nerves, then assails John for not protecting her from it. John storms out, and they do not see each other again.
Jerome, who also had no idea how to interpret John's story, wrote about it extensively in the 3rd edition of his book titled Unexplained, and he said this.
The reader puts down UFO warning, harboring the irritating suspicion that the author is sincere. Why would Stewart, if a hoaxer, have put himself at risk of legal retribution from an irate Wilkinson? Would she not have taken outraged exception to being inserted into a sex-drenched fantasy novel that worse pretended to be true? The reader mulls over these questions without ever quite abandoning the certainty that the events recounted could not have happened.
So I want to ask you guys, what do you think? Was John Stewart's book nothing more than a salacious tale of intergalactic love and possession? Or was this just a cleverly written cover story for his own character defects and extramarital affair? Unfortunately, folks, the guy is either really old or most likely dead. And with that said, it'll remain a mystery. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment down below, "Beware, Earthman." So that way I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive deep into the storytelling of the mysterious and supernatural, then you should totally smack that like and subscribe button for content just like this. As always, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.